Nash bought the saloon and the bride the same week, both cheap, both through the mail. What stepped off the stage at Drywell wasn't the cook in the letter, and she carried a clay jar no one in the territory had a name for. Within 3 months, that jar had filled the saloon and emptied the trade of the man who owned every drink for 40 miles, and he was ready to burn it down. Then people started getting sick, and the only one who could save them was the one with the most to hide. Stay until the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways held the line when the West couldn't. Drywell sat where the Arizona Territory ran out of ambition. A single street of plank buildings baked the color of old bone, with a saloon at the dead end that hadn't turned a profit in the whole year Nash had owned it. The town had been built for a silver strike that petered out in the first season, and the only thing left of the strike was the hole in the ground, and the men too stubborn or too broke to leave. Nash was one of the stubborn ones. He'd bought the place from a tax sale for the price of a used saddle, and he'd bought the bride from a catalog for about the same, because a man needed someone to run the kitchen, and he couldn't afford to be particular about it. The letter from the agency had promised a cook, a woman of plain habits and willing hands, and Nash had filed it between a feed bill and a property notice the way he filed everything, without reading it twice. The stage pulled in 2 hours late on a Tuesday. The team lathered and blowing, and the driver dropped the mail sack like it weighed nothing before he called out the one name on his list. Nash stood at the rail with his hat low against the afternoon glare, watching the canvas flap on the empty seat behind the driver, and then he saw her. She was already on the platform, standing with a single wooden trunk at her feet and a clay jar wrapped in oilcloth propped against her hip, and she hadn't waited for anyone to help her down. She was dressed in a plain dark wrap with a cloth over her hair, and she stood the way a person stands when they've already decided no one in the room is going to surprise them. He walked over and told her his name. She told him hers, Sujin, 2 syllables he had to ask her to repeat, and then she didn't say anything else for a long time. He picked up the trunk, and she picked up the jar, and she didn't let him carry it, and that was the first thing about her he couldn't make sense of. The whole street watched them walk to the saloon, and by the next morning the whole street had decided what to call her, and it wasn't her name. They called her the China Woman, the way a frontier town calls anything it can't place, by the nearest wrong word, and she heard it and didn't correct them. Nash heard it too, and he didn't correct them either, because he'd ordered a cook and not a cause, and he wanted to keep his trouble small. The saloon was a long, low room with a bar that had been built for a crowd that stopped coming 2 owners back, and the kerosene lanterns on the crossbeams threw an amber flickering light across empty tables and a back bar with 3 bottles on it. The whiskey was Cyrus Dodd's, and it was the only whiskey for 40 miles, because Cyrus owned the supply line and the debt on every saloon that tried to pour anything else. Nash owed him for the last 3 shipments, and the note was coming due, and the only thing in the room that smelled like money was the dust. He showed Sujin the kitchen, a narrow room off the back, with a stove that drew poorly and a shelf of dented pans. And he told her she could sleep in the storeroom above it. She looked at the stove and the shelf in the storeroom and said she would start in the morning, and that was the whole of her first day in Drywell. That first night after Nash had gone to sleep in the room behind the bar, Sujin carried her trunk down to the cellar and set it on the dirt floor where the air was coolest. She worked the false bottom loose with her fingers, the way a person does something they've done 1,000 times, and she lifted out a flat-pressed cake the color of old wheat, wrapped tight in cloth. The cake went on the shelf beside the jar, and beside it she laid a small bundle of dried roots and a pouch of something that smelled like burnt hay. The 2 halves of what she'd carried sat there together, the brewer's cake and the healer's herbs, and she covered them back over and left the cellar without turning up the lamp. What she'd brought across the ocean was a whole life, folded into a box the size of a saddlebag, and half of it she never meant to use. She worked the kitchen by day, and she worked it well enough that Nash stopped expecting her to fail at it, which was the most he had ever expected of anyone. She made plain food from what he could afford, beans and salt pork and bread, and she kept the stove going and the plates clean, and the few men who came in for a meal stayed for a second, because the food tasted like someone had paid attention to it. But she was down in the cellar every night after the lamps were out, and on the third night, Nash followed her. He came down the stairs with a lantern and found her at the shelf with the clay jar open and the pressed cake crumbled into a bowl, and she was steaming rice in a pot over a small fire she'd built on a brick. When he asked what she was making, the way he asked it made it clear he thought it might be trouble. She told him to come back in a week. It was a waste of good rice, he told himself, and a woman who'd been hired to cook shouldn't be brewing anything in his cellar, and he went back upstairs and didn't sleep well. Nash came down again the next night and the night after, and each time she was doing the same slow thing, and each time she told him the same thing, and he stopped coming down because he'd run out of ways to say no to a woman who never raised her voice. What she was doing was older than the territory, and older than the country that had built the territory, and she did it the way her mother had done it, and her mother's mother before that. She steamed the rice until it was soft but still whole, and she let it cool until it was warm to the touch and no warmer, because she knew that too much heat would turn the whole batch sour. She crumbled the pressed cake, the nuruk, into the water, and mixed it with the rice in the clay pot, and she covered the pot with a cloth woven loose enough that the gas could breathe out of it. The nuruk was the heart of it, a cake of crushed grain, left to gather its own yeasts and molds out of the air and the rice straw. It was born in, and her family had made theirs in the same room for 5 generations, so the room itself had grown into the cake. No 2 batches of a wild nuruk come out the same, and that was the part you couldn't write down, the part she had carried across the ocean in a false bottom. A brew made this way takes 7 to 10 days, and it can go wrong in 100 ways, and the only way to know is to read it. Sujin went down every night and pressed her palm flat against the side of the pot to feel the warmth, and she held her ear close to the cloth to hear whether the breath of it was steady or thin. Too cold and the ferment wouldn't start, and the pot would sit dead and sweet. Too warm, anything above the heat of a slow room, and the whole thing would turn to vinegar before she could stop it. She moved the pot twice in those 7 days, once when the cellar floor warmed from the stove above it, and once when the night air dropped, and she moved it the way a shepherd moves a flock, by reading the small signs and trusting her hands over her head. On the 8th morning she carried the pot up to the kitchen before Nash was awake, and she strained the brew through a square of fine cloth into a bowl, and what came through was a milky white wine, cloudy and faintly sweet, with a tang behind it and a small fizz on the tongue. A cup of it went on the bar, and when Nash came down she told him to drink. He looked at it the way a man looks at a drink he can't see through, and he drank, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. When she asked if it was good, he said he didn't know what it was. The word for it was Makgeolli, she told him, a word he had never heard and couldn't quite hold in his mouth. Where she'd learned to make it came next, and she said her mother, and that was the whole of her answer, and he knew better than to ask it twice. A second cup went down before the sun was up, and he stood in his own saloon drinking a thing he couldn't name and couldn't explain, and he didn't tell her to stop. Nash put the milky wine on the bar 2 nights later, in a bowl instead of a glass, because they only had 4 glasses, and he gave it a name he made up on the spot, because he couldn't say hers. The first man to try it was a ranch hand named Dell, who drank it on a dare and stood with the bowl in his hand, looking like he'd been asked to settle an argument with himself. He drank a second bowl before he said anything, and what he said was that it went down easy and didn't try to kill him on the way, which was more than he could say for Cyrus Dodd's whiskey. Dell brought 2 men the next night, and those 2 brought 4, and by the end of the week, the bowls were going out faster than Sujin could strain them. By the end of that week there was a line at the door, because the drink had a quality the frontier hadn't sold before. It was low in alcohol, low enough that a man could drink it all evening and still walk his horse home, and it was cold and slightly sweet, and it sat in the stomach, like food instead of fire. The men who drank it said they felt better the next morning than they had any right to, and the ones who'd had sour stomachs from the bad whiskey said the milky wine had settled them, though none of them knew the word for what was in it. Ward went out along the trail camps the way word does when something is cheap and good, and within a month, The saloon that couldn't pay its note had a crowd at the bar every night. Sujin brewed in larger batches now, 2 pots going at once in the cellar, and she fed the second pot a day after the first, with more steamed rice and more nuruk, the way her mother had taught her to deepen the flavor. A 2-stage brew makes a deeper drink because the second feeding wakes the ferment again and lets it build on itself, and she timed the second feeding by the smell of the first, not by any clock. She treated the cellar like a living thing, the way a person does something they've done 1,000 times, and she kept the pots in the cool corner and the cloth covers clean and the air moving and the batches held. Nash stopped asking how she did it, because the answer was always the same, and the money was better than any answer he'd had in a year. He bought her a second clay pot from a trader out of Tucson, and he bought her all the rice she asked for, and he didn't ask what she spent on the grain, because the bowls were paying for it twice over. What Nash didn't know yet was that the bowls had been counted, because a man who owns the only drink for 40 miles counts every bowl that isn't his. Cyrus Dodd came in on a Saturday, and he came the way a man comes who has owned a thing for a long time and has just heard someone else is touching it. He was a big man with a quiet voice and a wholesale account at the rail depot, and he'd sold whiskey to every saloon within 40 miles for 12 years, and he sat at the bar and watched the bowls go out and counted the men drinking them. He asked Nash who supplied the drink. Nash said he didn't supply it, he made it, which was close enough to the truth that he could say it without looking away. Cyrus asked to buy the recipe. Nash said it wasn't his to sell, and he looked toward the kitchen, and Cyrus followed the look. Cyrus went to the kitchen door and spoke to Sujin through it, and his voice was the kind of calm that only comes from having already decided what he'll do if he's refused a price for the method, was his offer. She said it wasn't for sale. Where she'd learned a thing like that in a place like this, he asked, and she said her mother, and he understood from the flat way she said it that the conversation was over. Back at the bar, he told Nash he still held the note on the saloon. 3 months of unpaid shipments, and the note was coming due at the end of the season. Then he left, and the room got quiet after him, in the way a room gets quiet after a man who doesn't need to raise his voice. Nash hadn't known Sujin would refuse, and Sujin hadn't known about the note, and they stood on opposite sides of the bar and looked at each other for the first time like 2 people who'd been in the same room without being in the same trouble. He told her she could have talked to him first. She told him she didn't know there was a note. He said there was always a note. She said the drink would pay it, and he said the drink would pay it if nothing went wrong. And the way he said it made it clear he expected something to go wrong, because in his experience, something always did. That was the first crack between them, and it was the kind of crack that doesn't close just because the money keeps coming in. 3 weeks later, a batch went wrong, and Sujin knew it before she opened the cellar door, because the smell came up the stairs wrong, sharp and sour, where it should have been warm and yeasty. She went down and found the pot pushed out of the cool corner and set against the stovepipe, and the side of it was hot to the touch, and the brew inside had gone to vinegar the way a brew does when it's been kept too warm for too long. She stood over it and read the cellar, the way she read a batch, by the small facts, and the facts said the pot had been moved by hands that knew what heat would do to it. A pot doesn't walk to a stovepipe on its own, and the cool corner where she'd set it was cool for a reason, and someone had carried the whole thing across the cellar in the dark and set it where the heat would ruin it slow. She saved what she could of the second pot, but the next night's pour tasted off, and the room noticed. Del set his bowl down after 1 sip and said it had turned, and the man next to him agreed, and the word went around the bar that the milky wine had gone bad. Sujin poured the spoiled batch out behind the saloon and started a fresh one, and she locked the cellar door with a latch she'd bought from the hardware store that morning, and she didn't say a word about any of it to Nash. She kept the new pot in the cool corner, and she kept the door latched, and she kept her own counsel, because the woman who'd taught her to brew had also taught her that a brewer's first job is to protect the pot, and her second job is to know when the pot is being hunted. She didn't accuse anyone, because an accusation without proof, in a town that called her the wrong name, would cost her more than a lost batch. But she knew whose hands had moved the pot because there was only one man in Drywell who had a reason to heat a brew he didn't own, and he had a cook's boy who would do a thing like that for a coin. The soot mark on the stovepipe was the first sign, a clean streak in the grease where the clay had rubbed it, and the cellar door stood unlatched. On a morning she'd latched it herself, and she filed the facts away the way her mother had taught her to file them, without anger and without forgetting. Asking around, in her own quiet way, who had been in the saloon after hours brought the same answer from two different mouths. A boy from the kitchen of the hotel down the street, the one Cyrus kept fed. That same week, a rancher who'd drunk the off-batch complained of a sour stomach, and then another did, and the rumor started that the milky wine was making people sick. Cyrus Dodd didn't start the rumor out loud, but he didn't have to, because a rumor in a small town feeds itself once it has a shape, and the shape of this one was that the foreign drink had turned on the people who drank it. The line at the door thinned to a few regulars, and then to Dell and one or two others, and the bowls went out slower every night. Nash watched the crowd walk out the door and felt the note sitting on his back like a stone, and he thought about what Cyrus had said about things going wrong, and he hated that the man had been right. Nash found her in the kitchen after the last customer left, and he stood in the door the way a man stands when he's brought a thing up that he's been holding for a week. The trust he'd given her with the kitchen was going bad out on the trail, he told her, and the saloon's name with it. Her answer was that the batch had been tampered with, and she said it the way she said everything, flat and without raising her voice. How she could know that was his next question. She said she knew. What else she knew that she hadn't told him came next, and the question sat between them. And she didn't answer it, and he went back to the bar and left her standing in the kitchen, with her hands still wet from the bowls. The boy and the soot mark and the unlatched door were what she had wanted to tell him, but she'd learned a long time ago that the truth is a thing you spend, and you don't spend it on a man who's angry because he'll hear it as an excuse. 2 weeks on, the sickness changed, and it stopped being a sour stomach, and became something else. A real fever moved through Drywell, the way a real fever moves through a town with one street and no doctor, and it started with the chills, and then the deep ache, and then a heat that wouldn't break, no matter how many blankets you piled on. 3 ranchers went down in the same week, and then the blacksmith, and then a woman who worked the laundry, and then Nash himself, and the saloon that had just filled up went empty again, for a reason no one could blame on the drink. The fever didn't care who'd drunk the milky wine and who hadn't, and it took the ones who'd never touched a bowl as hard as the ones who had, but that wasn't the story the town wanted to hear. The town turned on the milky wine fast, the way a town turns on the thing it can name when the thing it can't name is scaring it. Cyrus Dodd stood in the saloon on the day Nash couldn't get out of bed and said it plain that the foreign drink had brought the foreign sickness, and that the woman who'd brewed it had been hiding what she was since the day she stepped off the stage. He said the note was due in 10 days, and he'd take the saloon for what it was worth, which was nothing now that the sickness had taken the crowd and the name. He said it the way he said everything without raising his voice, and the men in the room didn't argue with him because they were scared, and he was the only one talking. Sujin stood in the kitchen doorway and heard all of it, and she didn't say a word, because she knew the fever wasn't the brew, and she knew the brew wouldn't clear her name, and she knew the only thing that would was the thing she'd sworn she'd never touch. Sujin knew the fever wasn't the brew, because she'd seen a fever like it before in a country far from this one, and it moved the same way, through the water and the close air, and it took the weak and the tired first. She'd watched it take 2 of her cousins when she was a girl, and she'd watched her mother fight it with the herbs and the moxa, and she'd learned the shape of it the way a child learns the shape of a fire, by watching it long before she was allowed to touch it. She knew the brew hadn't caused it, and she knew the brew wouldn't stop it, and she knew the one thing that might stop it was the thing she had sworn she would never open in this place. She went down to the cellar and stood in front of the shelf where the false bottom held the 2 halves of what she'd carried, the brewer's cake and the healer's herbs, and she looked at the herbs and understood that the time for hiding half of herself was over. She had come to Dry Well to bury who she was, and the brew had been the safe half, the half that couldn't trace her back, because a woman who makes a drink is just a woman who makes a drink. The medicine was the other half, the half that could. Because a woman who heals the way her family healed is a woman someone can name and follow back to a house and a history. She had kept the herbs wrapped and untouched for the whole time she'd been here, and she had told herself she would rather pour drinks in a strange town than be found out as the thing she'd run from. And she had meant it every day until this one. Now the only way to save the people who drunk her wine and called her the wrong name was to unwrap the herbs and let the town see what she could do, and she understood that the saving and the unmasking were the same act. She carried the bundle of dried roots and the pouch of moxa up the stairs, and she set them on the kitchen table in the amber light of the kerosene lamp, and she stood over them, the way a person stands over a door. They know they can't close again once they've opened it. Nash was in the back room with the fever on him, and she could hear him breathing wrong through the wall, and she picked up the herbs and walked into him. She had carried these roots across an ocean and a desert, and 100 miles of nothing, and she had never let another soul see them, and now she was about to use them on a man who'd ordered her through the mail and called her a cook, and she did not know what would be left of her when he'd seen what they could do. She started with Nash, because he was closest and because she needed him to see it work before anyone else did. A decoction of the dried roots went into a small pot over the kitchen stove, and the smell of it was bitter and green and nothing like the warm yeast of the cellar, and she made him drink it in sips while he lay in the sweat. Then she lit the moxa, a cone of dried mugwort the size of a thumb joint, and she held it over the skin of his back, at the points her mother had taught her, close enough to warm but not to burn, and the small cone smoldered slow and low and gave off a smoke that smelled like burnt hay. The way her mother had worked was the way she worked now, with her hands and her breath and her attention all in the same place, and she held each cone until the warmth had gone deep before she moved to the next point. The fever broke in Nash before morning, and he sat up in the dark and asked her what she'd done to him, and she told him the truth for the first time since she'd stepped off the stage. Her family in the old country were brewer healers, she told him, people who made the wine and kept the medicine, and she had run from a marriage and a purge that had taken the rest of them, and the trunk was all she had left of any of them. It came out the way she said hard things without performance and without asking to be forgiven for any of it, and Nash listened and didn't say anything for a long time, and then he asked her why she hadn't told him. The reason she hadn't was that he'd ordered a cook, and a cook was all he'd wanted, and he didn't argue with that because it was true. He asked her if the medicine would work on the others, and she said she thought it would, and he told her to go, and the way he said it was the first kind thing he'd ever said to her that wasn't about the kitchen. She went out into the town the next morning and treated the sick the same way, the decoction and the moxa and the slow low burn of the cones at the points the fever lived in, and she worked through the ranchers and the laundry woman and the blacksmith, who was the worst of them and took 3 days to break. She carried the herbs in a cloth bag and the moxa in a tin, and she went from house to house in the heat, and the town watched a woman they'd called the wrong name do something none of them could explain. They stopped calling her the wrong name while she worked, though no one quite got her real one right either, and a few of them started calling her the healer, which was closer to the truth than anything they'd called her yet. Dell was the first to thank her, and he did it by leaving a jar of honey on the bar without a word, and she understood the honey for what it was. A Korean merchant named Kim passed through on the rail line that week, a small man with a ledger and a sample case, and he heard there was a healer in Dry Well working in the old way, and he came to the saloon to see her. He watched her shape the moxa cones, the way she rolled them and set them, and he asked her where she'd learned the method, and she told him her mother. The name of her family's house came out of his mouth next. The house of brewer healers outside the old city, and he was the first person in the territory who knew what she was. No harm was what he meant her, and he told her so, and he offered to wire a buyer he knew in San Francisco, who would pay for the milky wine by the barrel, because a drink made with real Naruk was a thing people in the city would pay for. But now, someone new and a known thing in a territory is a thing that travels, and she understood that the hiding was over, whether the fever had ended or not. She thanked Mr. Spur Kim for the offer, told him to send the wire, and he did. And the answer came back the same day, a price per barrel that would have paid the note twice. Cyrus heard that the foreign woman was also a foreign healer, and that the fever was lifting, and that his sickness story was dying on him. The deadline on the note moved up. He came to the saloon the next morning and told Nash the 3 months were due in 3 days, not 10, and that he'd take the deed and the kitchen and the cellar and whatever was in it, and he said it in front of Sujin while she was still wiping the moxa smoke off her hands. A small smile crossed his face when he said it. The smile of a man who has run out of patience and is enjoying the feeling, and Sujin looked at him and said nothing because she had already decided what she was going to do. And a decision like that doesn't need an answer. Cyrus came back on the 3rd day with 2 men and the deed already drawn, and he expected to walk into a kitchen and a broken saloon and a woman with nowhere else to go. He walked into a room full of people who were alive, because of the woman he'd tried to ruin, and the room went quiet when he came through the door, the kind of quiet that isn't fear. The ranchers were at the tables, and the laundry woman was at the bar, and the blacksmith was in the corner with his arm still in a sling, and every one of them had been on their back with the fever a week before, and every one of them knew who'd stood them up again. Cyrus looked at the room and understood, in the slow way a man understands a thing he's already lost, that the story he'd been telling the town had turned against him while he wasn't in the room to tell it. Sujin didn't fight him with a gun, because she'd never owned one and wouldn't have known which end to point. She fought him with the thing she had. The merchant, Mr. Bursta. Kim was at the bar with a wire in his hand from a buyer in San Francisco who would pay for the milky wine by the barrel at a price that covered the note 3 times over, and he read the number out loud so the room could hear it. The ranchers were at the tables, Dell among them, and they told Cyrus to his face that they wouldn't drink his whiskey anymore, not because she'd asked them to, but because they'd made up their own minds about it. And the sickness story was dead, because the whole town had watched the fever break under her hands, and everyone in the room knew who'd killed it and who'd tried to blame it on the drink. She had not raised her voice once, and she did not raise it now, and she let the room do the work the room wanted to do. Nash stood up from the bar, still thin from the fever but on his feet, and he set the drink money on the wood, 3 months of shipments counted out in coin, and he pushed it across to Cyrus and told him the note was paid. He told him not to come back, and he said it the way Sujin said things, flat and without raising his voice. And Cyrus looked at the money and the room and the wire and the men who wouldn't buy from him, and he took the money and left. He wasn't destroyed, only diminished, and he'd still own the trade in the next town over, and that was the whole of his ending, because the West doesn't settle things clean. The 2 men he'd brought with him followed him out without saying a word, and the door swung shut behind them, and the room let out a breath it had been holding for an hour. Mr. Kim wired the buyer that afternoon, and the first barrels went out on the next rail car, and the fortune this story had promised became a real thing, made in a clay pot in a cellar, and shipped down the line to a city that would pay for it. The saloon belonged to Nash, but the drink and the money it made were hers, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it out loud, because it didn't need saying. Nash offered her a share of the saloon, the first time he'd offered anyone a share of anything, and she told him she'd take a share of the cellar and the kitchen, and no more, and he agreed because he'd learned by then that she meant exactly what she said, and not a word more. Sujin stood in the cellar with 2 pots fermenting, and the trunk open on the shelf, the false bottom no longer a secret. The fortune was brewed, and the past was no longer buried, and whether that was a win depended on what she'd been running from. If it moves you, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels.